All right, and welcome back. In this episode, I'm going to go over the bill that's going to regulate crypto, the Loomis-Gillibrand bill that's been reported in Protocol. So see you in just a moment. Welcome to Assembly Unfiltered. I'm your host, Satchel, and co-founder of Assembly, the Learn to Earn platform. Assembly Unfiltered is a podcast about democracy, privacy, blockchain, politics, leadership, company culture, crypto, security, and startups. It's meant for anyone who believes that all of us are living in challenging, turbulent, and even exciting times. We're living in a moment ripe for dramatic change. We envision this as a podcast for our tribe, people who share an interest in how all these threads weave together for better communities. This is meant for our learners, voters, advertisers, civic organizations, tech geeks, developers, and employees. I hope you enjoy this episode of Assembly Unfiltered. All right, so we're going to go over very quickly the highlights according to Protocol in their article, Crypto's Big Win, the Loomis-Gillibrand bill puts the CFTC in charge, and go over some of their recommended regulations. However, the rest of this, I'm going to drill down a little further about why I think regulation is good and what that regulation could potentially look like. I'm trying to provide a little bit more coloring in this. But my hope is that other people who are perhaps more knowledgeable about how regulation works, or even with their experience in blockchain and tokens, can weigh in. My sort of perspective is that Regulation A is a good thing. It just needs to be different. And that regulations for securities is because there's a lot of bad behavior that can go on in the way those securities are sold and marketed and reported. And I think tokens on the blockchain actually alleviate a lot of that. So it should actually be a transition from more sort of bureaucracy and paperwork, which I would characterize to current securities regulation, with more transparency. So let's first start with sort of the key points that came from this article. So it outline some key provisions, such as the creation of a federal regulatory sandbox. And within the sandbox, crypto companies will be able to introduce and test innovative products in a controlled environment. Seems, I guess, reasonable. I'm not exactly sure how that would look like, but perhaps it's like a token modeling environment or a way to, demonstrate a pilot how they operate. I'm not exactly sure. The second one was people can make purchases with appreciated virtual assets without having to account for and report income up to a certain threshold. So certainly there's going to be some tax implications of reporting. And I think that's important to do because I think it's very difficult to do right now. And in some cases, it's sort of like not really warranted. And then suggest the creation of a private financial regulatory group, kind of like FINRA. So all basically good things. I think what's missing is, well, what is the nature of regulations for those cryptos that are going to fall under it? And it sort of alludes to it, but it's not that clear. And I referenced this in an earlier episode when I'm talking about why we picked the dual token model, and said that there should be a right kind of regulation that prioritizes transparency over bureaucracy. And the reason is, on the blockchain and when we're dealing with tokens, pretty much everything is much more transparent. Like, you can actually report in real time. There's some very cool tools like Dune Analytics, which allow you to really create very accessible graphs. I think if there are regulations on the information that was displayed in these graphs requiring certain information to be displayed, I think that would be a huge boon. And so I walk through sort of my thoughts about what those could be, and I go to a really old article written by a venture capitalist, Bill Gurley, and he wrote this I don't remember when. I found it on the internet, and it's called Internet Investors Beware of the Proxy Valuation. It might have been like in 1998, way early, kind of in the dot-com boom era, because the essence of his article was saying it's so early, this thing is a new technology, these are really early startups, they're growing really fast, and so a lot of them are using proxies to tell their story. And there's some risks when you're dependent on a proxy, because if it at all deviates, or he calls it an arbitrage of long-term cash flows, then that's actually not going to be good, because at the end of the day, the most reliable way, it's granted it's difficult, is to be able to discount all future cash flows and then come up with a valuation. And that's super hard to do, especially for early companies where there's a lot of doubt and questions and so forth. But the thing I take away from that is, even though it's hard to gauge, any way that you can provide visibility so that somebody can start to make reasoned guesses on what that will look like, and everyone's kind of like looking at the same set of data, is definitely valuable and useful. And that's probably the role of regulators, which is to ensure that there's an understandable, auditable standard. I think eventually kind of like hovering around metrics that'll help people to infer, perhaps it's a proxy, but it's like to get close to this free cash flow or discounted cash flow is useful. Now, this article from Investopedia on free cash flow talks about why it's both a good metric, but how it can also be manipulated. So it talks about how people can underreport capital expenditures and temporarily boost their free cash flow by stretching out payments, so it's kind of like changing their procurement process, stretching out payments and tightening collections. Another way they can do it is manipulating receivables, so calling receivables for a delayed cash settlement, but then still reporting that as revenue. So all of those things are really tricky. And I think that that's legitimate why regulators should be stepping in, is they're trying to provide that information, but they're also trying to provide laws to limit that unnecessary manipulation. However, what's interesting, at least right now, with tokens and blockchains and crypto, is much of that can actually be directly inspected. It's almost as if like for public companies, you had access to their ERP and accounting systems and were able to evaluate in real time a company. Now, that's not really possible now. That would be a mess, because there's so much that kind of needs to be adjusted. But I think if it's designed right, token projects should actually be able to provide a very, very reasonable framework. And so the one that I think of goes back to, for those of you who are into systems thinking or systems dynamics, is the ecosystems for tokens really fit within those big buckets of flows. So there's a cash inflow, there's stock flows, there's flows for the tokens. Stock, which is, how much might be sitting in the treasury, how much token stock there is. Outflows are burns or stakes. Loops, defining what the feedback loop is into the system. So, for example, we use a burn mint equilibrium, so that has a loop feedback. And then what are the formulas or the algorithms that are determining, say, either the rate of burn or the rate of mint, or how much gets allocated to tokens out of the treasury? Like, all those things can start to be provable. And so once you do that, I have a little diagram which just shows if you could start to draw out the basic stock and flow, it gives people a high-level concept of the system dynamics of your token. So let's take a look here at the kind of information that we would be comfortable, because it's already going to be on chain. It's just the regulators would just need to say it needs to be in this format. Hopefully it's lightweight, so it doesn't create more bureaucracy, but they're really trying to encourage a standard for how to report and to understand the definitions of what's being reported. So in our case, someone will be able to tell the cash spent by advertisers on the network, because in order for them to spend on the network, they have to prepay some budget amount, and that varies by the amount of spend and how large they are and the state of our business. And they generate learn tokens. So those learn tokens will be on chain. So as if anybody can run a metric on, well, how many learn tokens were minted, they know immediately how much cash was put into the system. Now, do we have access to that? No, because we have a performance-based ad model. So we don't actually earn the money until the learn tokens have been dispensed and consumed. But that's also available on chain. So people will be able to see what the amount of cash that's been imputed back to the business when they see these learn tokens sort of being consumed when the ad gets consumed. So when, in our case, those learn tokens get consumed when an ad is viewed by a viewer, and some percentage of those tokens are given back to the viewer, the learner of the ad, as an incentive for them to participate in our micro courses in the Learn to Earn protocol. And then the rest of the cash that was spent is technically released into our treasury for us to spend. But the rest of it remains sort of locked in their account until those Learn tokens are then released. The other token is the vote token, which is our value seeking token. And those also can be measured and visible on chain. So you can see the amount that's being minted, what's the total supply, how close is it to the max supply, how many of those are staked, how many of those have been locked, how many of them actually get burned to release the Learn token, which is also super valuable. We have a burn mint equilibrium, and so that means if there's more people who want to buy more advertising, they need to convert their dollars into Learn tokens. But in order to do that, they have to burn vote tokens, which are of limited supply. And so somebody being able to have metrics of, well, how much vote tokens need to get burned in order to generate the Learn tokens can kind of start to guesstimate, well, what's the dollar value of the vote token, since every Learn token is at a fixed price of 1 cent. We also can give people a sense of the nature of the business in a more transparent and honest way. So we'd be able to display the number of KYC'd learners, the people who are actually going to be engaging with the ads. And so unlike, say, a Twitter, where a huge percentage of them could be bots, but it's disputed, Musk thinks there's more, how do you prove how many there are? It's sort of like very opaque. We'd be able to say the opposite. We would be able to show and cryptographically prove, well, someone has been KYC'd, so it's a legitimate identity based on government documents and facial recognition. We can't display any PII about any given individual, but we can tell you the counts are not bots. There's some kind of real person. The same way we can also disclose, well, how many advertisers are there actually on the system, and what are they spending? Now that might make most companies uncomfortable. Like, that's very transparent. Somebody may want to hide that, and it is uncomfortable. In the short and medium term, I have a feeling it's always going to cause the business to be undervalued, because the numbers aren't ever going to look great. It's getting a business up and going and off to the right is super hard to do. But I believe that as the landscape starts to evolve and people actually start to trust the system, not just investors, but the advertisers and the users, regulators, it'll actually play in our benefit. So we're just starting off in that way. So providing that data and leveling the playing field with other projects to make those standardized actually does benefit us. And I think it'll benefit any project that really has very strong fundamentals underneath it. In many ways, tokens are a pure form of a security. Like, it takes away all sort of the interpretation and the accounting rules and sort of the calculations and then all this other stuff that needs to go into it. Now, someone could come back and say, well, that's a problem with it. You're just looking at things that are on chain. Some things are going to get aggregated, like the spend on R&D. That's just going to be just some big, probably some flat number. But, as things mature and we're like maybe paying people transparently in a mixture of cash and tokens or something, that might become more visible on chain. I'm not really sure. I think this is really a wide open space where it's totally transparent. But if that's the direction that we're going, which is, hey, show some transparency, let's not overdo it. Let's look at the basics in a framework. We want to know that there's money coming in. We want to have some visibility and money going out. We want to have some visibility into the nature of your token supply. What's the value-seeking token? What are the loops, the feedback loops that are feeding into that value, that could govern that value or the supply, and any sort of underlying algorithms that are governing. I think that can be presented in both graphs and some very basic auditable forms of code, which really does help simplify. I mean, you couldn't do that with most businesses these days, but with projects being designed from the ground up to think about the value capture of the token across all stakeholders, and you're building on a blockchain, I really do think that that's a different way of thinking. And so when starting with the strong fundamentals, now that starts to play out. Right now, a lot of the tokenomics reporting for, these altcoins, they're just talking about what's the number of supply, how much was pre-minted, what's the starting price and the floor price. That doesn't tell you really anything. Here, we are able to start with the foundation of mechanics that tie in actual money that's coming into the system that's providing utility, a direct association with what the value-seeking token is, and how we're able to distribute it in a Web3 fashion, which in our case is we distribute the learn token, the work token, which has a redemptive value, back to all of our voters. And so the learners, so it's large margins, we have a large growing market that's in the billions, and that mechanism is very direct and visible. So I believe that gives a really good starting point. So to me, when looking at regulation, my takeaway is as long as it's geared towards being lightweight, standardized, and there's transparency around basic economic framework of what a meaningful enterprise is. It means it should capture money, should spend less than it's taking in, and there should be some way that all parties are being rewarded in relationship to their ownership and participation in the token. So this is going to continue to be a real big point of discussion. For me, this is just the opening salvo, and really would love to hear from other people. So if you have comments, you can come and look at the show notes. There's a place where you can record your own message if you want to. You can click through to the blog post where I think we can there's a forums, link to forums to comment directly on there, and really hope to hear more ideas from other people on this topic.